The degrowth debate stems from a very, apparently very obvious question, a very key question. Is it possible to have an economic system that is based on infinite growth while our planet has limited resources? And if it's not possible, what are the alternatives to this system? To talk about these key economic ideas, we have brought you 4 experts from around the world. We have made a conscious effort on inviting experts from the global south. The idea of economic growth obviously is very, very different depending on where you see it from. It's obviously also different from for men and for women, and it's different for different groups. So today we have with us Ricardo Mostini. He is a PhD candidate at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona in Spain. We have Achu Gervais. I don't know if I'm pronouncing your names right. If I make any mistakes in pronouncing your names, please don't hesitate to correct me when you have the floor. So Achu Gervais is a South Sudanese economist, feminist, and peace activist who currently works as a research assistant at the University of Khartoum in Sudan. We have Gabriela Cabaña and Pedro Glatz, who both are part of the Chilean Center of Socio-Environmental Analysis. Gabriela is an Anthropology PhD researcher at the London School of Economics, and Pedro is an activist and parliamentary advisor on environmental regulation, currently working at the Chilean Congress. So pretty busy days for you, Pedro, I believe. Okay, so I will not take any more time as we have very limited time with us, and I will give the floor directly to our speakers. I haven't thought of any particular order that makes more sense than the others, so I will start with Ricardo, then I will move to Elizabeth Achu, and then I will go to Gabriela and Pedro, if that's okay. So Ricardo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Santiago, and good day, everyone. I'm very glad to be here with you today. And in my opening remarks, which I'll try to keep brief to 10, max 15 minutes, I'd like to discuss the theory of degrowth as a framework for overcoming the false dichotomy between addressing global poverty and avoiding the ecological breakdown. The question is usually articulated in these terms. Either we stop the growth machine for the sake of ecological stability and in doing so sacrifice the poor, or we improve the lives of the poor but sacrifice the ecology on which we depend. It's apparently a double blind, but fortunately there is a way out. The key is to recognize that we don't live in a poor world that needs more growth. On the contrary, we live in a world that's already incredibly rich. We have more than enough to end global poverty many times over. The problem is that it's all captured at the very top. When we normally think of the global poor, we tend to imagine people who are somehow cut off from the global economy. People who live in backwaters untouched by globalization, unconnected from the lives of people who live in Europe and North America. But this image gives us a completely wrong impression. The poorest 60% of humanity are deeply integrated into the circuits of global capital. They work in the sweatshops of multinational companies. They spend their lives mining the rare earth minerals that we depend on for our smartphones. They harvest the tea leaves and coffee beans and sugar cane that most people consume every day. And in many cases, theirs is the land from which the oil and coal and gas that powers the global economy is extracted. All told, these people contribute to the vast majority of their labor and resources that get into the global economy. And yet, in return, they receive only about 5% of total global income. By contrast, the vast majority of new income from global growth has gone to the world's rich. The richest 1% alone capture $19 trillion in income every year, which represents nearly a quarter of global GDP. The rich therefore lay claim to a truly staggering share of the income that the global economy generates, which is extracted from the lands and the bodies of the poor. Since 1980, 28% of new income from global GDP growth has gone to the richest 1%. In other words, nearly a third of all the labor we have rendered, all the resources we have extracted, and all the CO2 we have emitted over the past half century has been done to make rich people richer. It makes therefore little sense to call for more growth in order to improve the lives of the poor when the vast majority of it just goes straight to the already rich. A recent study found that given the existing rate at which income from growth trickles down to the poor, it will take about 200 years to bring everyone in the world above the poverty line. And to get there, we will need to grow the global GDP to 175 times its present size. That's also 170 times more extraction and production and consumption that we are already doing. The scale of this is horrifying to contemplate. As a strategy for ending poverty, this approach is both terribly inefficient and ecologically insane. It is an approach wildly out of step with any understanding of planetary boundaries. There is simply no way this can be achieved without triggering a truly catastrophic climate change. A destabilization of the global atmosphere that would obliterate any potential gains from poverty reduction. But the good news is that we don't need aggregate global growth to end poverty. To bring everyone in the world above the poverty line of $70.40 per day would require about $6 trillion. That's a significant sum on the face of it. But notice that it's only 1/3 of the annual income of the richest 1%. By shifting $6 trillion of excess income from the richest 1% to the poorest 4.2 billion people, we could end poverty in a stroke and still leave the richest with an average annual income of nearly $180,000 per year, which is a sum that is more than anyone could ever reasonably need. When we think about growth, the growth conundrum that I was laying out at the beginning, from this angle, the supposed double bind between ending mass poverty and restoring ecological stability melts away and reveals a much easier choice. A choice between living in a more equitable society on the one hand and risking ecological catastrophe on the other. I believe that if asked, most people would have little difficulty choosing between the two. Now, another point that I like to discuss, because I believe it's relevant to our conversation today, is the fact that wealthy countries pride themselves in thinking that they are already doing their part in decarbonizing their economies, and that global South countries should grow their economies because that's what enables the transition towards sustainability. But let's take a closer look at this claim. The latest UN framework for assessing countries' progress towards a green economy is the Sustainable Development Goals Index. This metric tells a very clear story. Sweden, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, and most other rich Western nations rise to the top of the rankings, giving casual observers the impression that these countries are real leaders in achieving sustainable development. But there is just one problem with this story. Despite its name, the SDG index has very little to do with sustainable development at all. In fact, oddly enough, the countries with the highest scores on this index are some of the most environmentally unsustainable countries in the world. Take Sweden, for example. Sweden scores an impressive 84.7 on the index, topping the pack. But ecologists have long pointed out that Sweden's material footprint, amounting to 32 metric tons per person, is one of the biggest in the world. To put this in perspective, we should bear in mind that the sustainable level is about 7 tons per person. In other words, Sweden is consuming nearly 5 times over its fair share. Another example worth looking at is Finland, which is number 3 on the SDG index. Well, Finland's carbon footprint is about 13 metric tons of carbon dioxide per person per year. This makes it one of the most polluting countries in the world in per capita terms, and a major contributor to climate breakdown. If the whole world were to consume as much fossil fuels as Finland does, well, the planet would be literally uninhabitable. And this is not just a matter of a few odd results that I picked and choose. Data shows that all of the top-ranking countries in the SDG index have significantly overshot their fair share of planetary boundaries in consumption-based terms. So the bottom line of the argument I'm trying to make here is that it would be physically impossible for all nations to consume and pollute at the level of the SDG top performers without destroying our planet's biosphere. In other words, the SDG index is, from the perspective of ecology, incoherent. It creates the illusion that rich countries have high levels of sustainability when in fact they do not. An index that, in my opinion, better captures what human development should look like in an ecologically full world is the Sustainable Development Index. This index measures the ecological efficiency of human development, recognizing that development must be achieved within planetary boundaries. By the way, you can access it at the URL sustainabledevelopmentindex.org. So this index starts with the base components of the Human Development Index, meaning life expectancy, education, and income. But then it tweaks the income index so that it incorporates a sufficiency threshold at $20,000 per person per year, since research shows that above this point, additional income becomes unnecessary for achieving strong social outcomes. Once calculated the indicators of life expectancy, education, and income, the Sustainable Development Index divides them by the ecological overshoot, meaning the extent to which consumption-based CO2 emissions and material footprint exceed per capita shares of planetary boundaries. And as a result, countries that have high human development with low ecological impact rise to the top of the index. On the contrary, countries with low human development index and countries with high human development but high ecological impact fall to the bottom of the index. In this way, the Sustainable Development Index promotes a vision for progress in the 21st century, one which is actually compatible with the ecology of our planet. So to succeed in terms of Sustainable Development Index, poor nations must significantly improve human development while keeping their ecological impact within planetary boundaries, while rich nations must maintain or potentially even enhance human development while significantly reducing their ecological impact down to sustainable levels. In light of this consideration, we should regard countries that rank high in the Sustainable Development Index, such as Costa Rica, Cuba, Albania, and Georgia, just to give some examples, not as underdeveloped, but rather as appropriately developed. We should look at societies where people live long and happy lives at low levels of income and consumption, not as backwaters that need to be developed according to Western models, but rather as exemplars of efficient living, and begin to call on rich countries to cut their excessive consumption. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. That was really, really interesting. We already have a few questions for Ricardo, but I think we better go with the three of them because maybe some questions will be answered in some of the presentations, and then at the end we can bring all the questions together, if that is okay. So right now we're going to switch the order a little bit, as has been requested. And we're gonna give the floor now to Pedro and Gabriela. Just to remind you, Pedro and Gabriela come from the Center of Socio-Environmental Analysis in Chile. They have different backgrounds. Gabriela is an anthropologist and Pedro is a historian, but they both are interested in human ecology and economics. And they are going to bring us a vision of degrowth and degrowth theory and proposals from Latin America. So the floor is yours, guys.
Gabby, you first.
Yeah, I was about to tell you. I think it makes more sense if I go first. Thanks. Thank you everyone. Thank you Santiago, Ricardo, to Pedro, my fellow panelists here. It's really good to go right after Ricardo because I feel we're gonna have a nice dialogue, and I'm going to build a bit in the main ideas that he gave in the outline that he did. And the key idea that I would like to bring in today is that degrowth is an approach and a critique to narrow understandings of climate change that forces us to include wider social, political, and ecological dimensions whenever we think about how to solve this issue of climate change. So as you might know, if you know anything about degrowth, you probably know that it's a debate that has been centered in Europe and has been often described as a proposal for rich countries. And I would like to give a different perspective now and see how this school of thought can be seen and how it can contribute to transformative struggles outside this continent, in particular from a Latin American perspective and from Chile, which is where I'm from and where I'm doing my research currently at the moment. So what we need to keep in mind, together with what Ricardo just explained very well, is that degrowth is not only about committing consciously to reduce our material and carbon footprint. That's like the key idea, to keep Earth inhabitable. But it's also a critique to our current official policy approaches. And it's also an acknowledgement of all the inequalities that have brought us to our current scenario. So it's constantly bringing history, it's constantly bringing political relations, it's constantly bringing power struggles into the way we think. So in these 15 minutes, I would like to make 3 points with this approach in mind, which is one, that we need to question the global north, global south analytical divide that is very often in the way we think about climate change. Number 2, that we need to question this narrative of catching up that is often also very often used as a narrative in the way we speak about climate change. And number 3, I will make the urgent point to focus not only on emissions, but on all ecological destruction and the social oppression that is happening hand in hand, that goes hand in hand with ecological destruction. So it's just going to be these 3 brief points, so then we can have more of a conversation. So in my first idea on this question of who needs to degrow, we usually talk about the pertinence of degrowth from a global north, global south language. But I believe these divisions are often misleading. And whenever we start actually paying more attention to where these relations of extraction and colonialism are, we can see that actually we have many norths in the south and many souths in the north. So really, national boundaries are not all that matter. And this becomes evident when we think about colonial relations and colonial structures beyond, as I said, national boundaries. And we see how, for instance, metropolitan elites establish relations of colonialism with the countryside in our region in Latin America or in our country in Chile. And just to bring an example from my research, I'm currently doing research in an archipelago in the south of Chile called Chiloé. And it's a territory that has been historically exploited and degraded in the benefit of foreigners that come there, invest, and make a lot of money while destroying all the ecological fabric of life, and also paying taxes in the capital, Santiago. So these sort of injustices and these sort of internal colonial relations are made invisible when we think only about national boundaries. So all this language of global north and global south actually make it harder to think about the nature of the problem. When we think about who needs to degrow, we need to think not only about, for instance, cutting our dependency and our extraction with other continents, but also how those same relations actually exist inside our own societies. And this inequality is very, very important. So we must keep in mind all these scales of oppression as they overlap, and they work in different ways. And staying with these too broad and often misleading divisions can make us miss this problem of internal colonialism. So that's the first idea. The second one is that there is no need to catch up. So I will make the point that there is no need to restrict the degrowth debate and the degrowth perspective in principle just to a handful of rich countries that are already in the developed end. And here I couldn't help notice that in the description of this event, you wrote that the degrowth movement is built on the belief that the developed world should let others catch up. And I want to challenge this assumption and to be provocative and see if you agree with this or not, because why would we want to emulate an ecocidal economy that has not been built in bringing well-being and freedom to the majorities? Why would we want to follow the same trajectory? Why would we want to repeat and lock in this a very intensive society that relies on high levels of extraction, high levels of energy, high levels of material flow? That would be madness if we already know, as Ricardo so well explained, that that form of development, that form of well-being is actually just not physically sustainable. We cannot allow ourselves to do that. So why should we want to do that? So yes, I would say we do need space, and degrowth allows for that space, but we do not need space to catch up, but actually to do our own political projects, not for growth. And this is important because growth has actually been used as a political project, as a way of understanding our horizon of progress, our horizon of what society we want to be. And we should challenge that, and we should think about new political projects that are our own. And here, speaking from Latin America, we have such a rich region of traditions that are outside this imaginary of growth, a whole set of post-extractivist traditions, including the worldwide known idea of buen vivir and other indigenous understandings of what does it mean to live together well in harmony with each other and with the environment. So we have our own traditions of what could be a good life, and having degrowth will allow us to have more space to make those political projects feasible. So we need to have degrowth in these imperial centers, wherever they are, wherever country they are, so we can allow these other political projects to appear in the peripheries that are often exploited. So that's my second idea about challenging this catching up narrative that is also very much thought in a developmentalist narrative, of like having some of us in the past and how we need to get to the future that is actually the present of other places that are in a better position. So this is important. And the third thing that brings more to the intersection between degrowth and climate change is that it's not all about emissions. And this is very key, and sometimes I think it can be a bit unpopular. So as it is a holistic approach, degrowth reminds us that we can still get to net zero emissions and lose. So this is not our only standard of what sort of action we want to take. We could still get to net zero emissions while ignoring, for instance, all other biodiversity breakdown, ignoring the mass extinction that is taking place, and we could still get to net zero while perpetuating the logic of sacrifice zones and perpetuating the logic of extractivism, and doing now extractivism in the name of this green transition that needs to take place. And we need to be constantly looking into climate policy with this in mind. What is the ecological cost, for instance, of manufacturing green hydrogen that is now very much on fashion everywhere in the world? What is the price of manufacturing this green fuel, this green hydrogen for Europe, for instance, without considerations of the environmental impact that it has to produce that fuel in places like Chile, in places that are very rich in renewable energies, and now might be put to the service of these huge, very invasive infrastructures that will produce this so-called green hydrogen. So for instance, here in our desert, in the Atacama Desert, are we going to kill the rich bacterial life of the desert in the name of producing green energy, for instance? Are we going to perpetuate this idea that, oh, the desert is empty, the desert is dead, so we can do whatever we want there, and we can produce magically all this green hydrogen that will be used in cars elsewhere? Well, this is problematic. This is, again, reproducing the idea that some places can be sacrificed and destroyed in the name of the development of others, and in the name of the continuation of a certain lifestyle of other people in other places. And this is also, for instance, happening in Chiloé, where big wind farms are being installed in places that have delicate ecosystems and peat bogs that are what keeps the water and what cleans the water for all the islands. And now these wind turbines are actually displacing and destroying that soil, and they're compromising the possibility of having water for people and for other living things. So what is really the point of going green and supporting this green energy and this renewable energy if you're actually, for instance, destroying water security and water availability? There seems to be a contradiction there, and we too often ignore what that impact would be in the territories where these solutions are being implemented. So we need to have always this ecosystemic, holistic understanding in mind whenever we look into policy, into climate policy. And what I think it's relevant of degrowth when we have this in mind is that it can help us, just like Ricardo said, see through this dilemma of saying, oh, you know, but we must build these wind turbines, whatever the price, we must do it because we need to stop, we need to leave fossil fuels behind. But we can change the question and we can see this dilemma in a different light when we ask ourselves, do we actually need to take our current energy use level for granted as the only form of a good life? And the answer of degrowth is no. It is actually, we could lower our energy consumption, and we could think about different arrangement of how energy circulates, it's generated and circulates in society that will bring well-being to everyone, and that will bring food, shelter, education, health to everyone, and we don't have to go back to poverty and like give up on the good things that we like of our current society. So this is actually possible when we open our imagination, that we don't need to just keep and perpetuate eternal growth as our only horizon, as our only way of understanding what we could do, what we can act. So with this, we can start thinking about more creatively about how to get out of these contradictions that are very violent and are in place right now in our mainstream policy, in our official policy. So just to close, I would make the point for degrowth, since it offers an holistic, historicized, and politicized approach to climate change that can contribute to environmental justice and profound transformations, and we should always bring it in whenever we're talking about climate change and how to address climate change. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Gabi, and thanks, Ricardo, for your inspirational presentations. And first of all, I would like to thank you to Climate Tracker because it's such a nice initiative, and it has helped me a lot to surf in the intricacies of environmental governance and climate change governance during my visits to the last two COPs. For an humble Chilean activist and parliamentary advisor, it would have been completely impossible to follow all the discussion. So thank you, and keep doing the amazing job that you're doing. All said that, I would like to focus, after these two inspirational interventions, I would like to focus from my expertise, or sort of expertise, which is mostly political politically based, or that's where my experience lies now. So I would like to propose sort of a strategy or maybe ideas how to follow, how to build a degrowth movement, which is not just activist based, but also trying to make the structures change, and specifically the political institutions here in Latin America. So I would like to divide my presentation into 3 phases. First, I would like to point out a few ideological principles which this presentation is based. Then the second part will be like a more general question of what should we be doing in Latin America, which are the economical discussions, social discussions, which policies should we be discussing. And third, a bit of a more strategical initiative, like who are the groups, who are the movements, the political parties, and the mobilization strategies that we should be using to impose a degrowth campaign. So it maybe sounds a little strong, but I strongly agree with my fellow colleagues here in this panel that this is the road that we should be not just following, but building and creating and fast. So my ideological principles that I mentioned are, first of all, the conviction that we need to degrowth. The scale of the task to tackle climate change and ecological destruction is basically impossible to achieve without the decrease in production, consumption, and resource use that we are proposing. The evidence is completely overwhelming. IPCC, International Agency of Energy, and even the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Itlands Food Commission, you can name it. We have dozens of well-respected scientific groups, boards saying that there's no silver bullet, and we have to conduct massive change on all of these dimensions, social dimensions that we are collapsing. That's I guess the consensus, and you are obviously quite familiar with those diagnoses. Again, a second ideological principle already mentioned by Gavi is that this pattern cannot be the road for developing countries. There's no need to catch up with an ecocidal development model. Then the third principle, it would be that Latin America, even if I don't like this narrative of comparative advantages, I think it's useful because it's a well-known topic, has comparative advantages that are huge. We are and crazy how many resources we have. It's maybe the most intense resource per capita region. We have also a bigger institutional capacity as other regions on the global south, even when we here in Latin America don't like to greet ourselves or celebrate the current situation, political and social situation. I think it's a fact that we do have stronger states than other regions from the global south. And we also have something which is quite profound and unique. We have a positive collective identity. We have a history of political and social struggles from the independence process, and then obviously the agrarian reform movements, and as a whole, I guess, a collective identity that we have to mobilize. And it has been slowed down over the last couple of years, but definitely we have a strong basis to build from. And then also another idea from this principle is that the effects of climate change, of course, are going to be huge, as in other regions. But I will it's a summary, obviously, so you can contest this idea. But still, they're not going to be apocalyptical, as in other regions, like the northern parts of Africa or the Middle East as a whole. So we are still do have a bit more time, of course, not so much. And the fourth ideological principle is that we have to build a discourse about the politicization of technology. We have to have a collective idea as a region of how to deal with technology, the technology that we need to tackle climate change and ecological crisis. But at the same time, do not believe in this narrative of silver bullets and just focus both on the necessary recognize traditional technologies that have been used for centuries and even millennia here in our region, and they're really, really important to this challenge that we have ahead. The century of the big challenge, as a Spanish philosopher, Jorge Richman, always likes to describe the current time that we're facing. So the second part of my presentation will try to focus more on what to do. And again, I will propose a bit of some foundations. First of all, we have to think about degrowth as a social justice movement. It's not a hippie agenda. It's not a first world or a global north agenda. It's the best way to provide social justice, equality, and material well-being, and emotional and spiritual well-being for the inhabitants of our region, Latin America. Second foundation is that we will not solve the ecological crisis without regional integration. That's another foundation. Third one is this movement has to be science-based, and I guess that Ricardo's presentation was quite great to show that degrowth is a science-based movement, not exclusively, but it's strongly based on that. And the fourth idea is that we have to develop a new idea of sovereignty in many different dimensions, both on the discussion of what the national states are supposed to do, but also some production sovereignty in many phases as the most recognized food sovereignty. So what to do with the economical model? I will say that we should definitely use this current time of Corona and the strong idea that is slowly going to the minds of the Latin American inhabitants about the need of having a more localized system of production. We are already quite scared of the situation when the vaccine will be created and will be manufactured. It will be mostly manufactured on the global north. So we have to use this moment to put on people's minds that the local production is both better at a sustainability level, but also as a safety and health level for our population. I will say that we have to start to have the tough discussions as the need to change our economical model based on the international commerce. Of course, we don't have to destroy it, but we definitely have to regulate it. And I think that a sane international commerce model that internalizes the ecological costs of what are we doing currently in Latin America and in the globe as a whole will definitely promote a decrease in international commerce and a focus on the most needed commodities to ensure social and sustainable health for everyone in our society. So obviously a lower usage of resources and a strategy of recycling and reuse of many commodities that we are currently not producing here. And maybe the most important idea is the improvement of material well-being for the people of Latin America, and obviously with new indicators of well-being. Because when we talk, obviously as a global South region, we are completely obsessed with GDP growth, and considering that the agricultural sector, it's so big in our environmental footprint and also in our economy. I think that's one interesting aspect of our economy to focus on, because it has all of the interesting aspects that degrowth integrates into the political discussion. First of all, GDP growth in the agricultural sector means most of the time means commodifying people, commodifying their incomes. So of course, if we put family agricultural initiatives that were not part of the formal markets into the economy, it's going to show as economical growth. But we certainly know that this insertions of people just makes their social well-being worse. And we definitely have to design better ways of producing more and better output of some products, like healthy and sustainable diets. We're the region with the most expensive healthy diet on Earth. We just last Saturday, we were checking on a recent report here in Chile, and just in Chile, 27% of the people cannot afford a healthy diet. We are the region with the biggest obesity rates in the world. And obviously, that's a discourse, while at the same time, there's still millions of people suffering from hunger. So we definitely have to think about new ways and how to compress the idea of degrowth and well-being. And last but not least, definitely build the idea that degrowth is not just about decreasing the economy as a whole, but mostly in places like Latin America, decrease certain activities, and they are quite focused. So fossil fuels in general, we should obviously cut it and decrease the amount of people that are currently working or dependent on that industry. Luxury consumption. We definitely can regulate luxury consumption on the most unequal continent in the whole world. We have to build that narrative. And linked to that, just to finish my presentation, the third point is the discussion of how to build a coalition for degrowth. So this includes the development of a political strategy that includes discourse, the identification of which organizations are have to participate in this process. How do we reach people? How do we reach different initiatives that are already practicing degrowth, even if they don't know it or don't politically acknowledge it? And obviously, this has to include, first of all, political parties, which currently are completely lacking any ideological or economical proposal that is not based on the Washington Consensus from the 90s. So that's an interesting aspect to discuss. Here in Chile, we're now discussing a new constitution. So it's the best laboratory to engage into these discussions. Can we grow a new development project that it's based on this narratives that are already growing across our continent, like Buen Vivir, as Gabriela mentioned? And here, just for finishing my intervention, I think that it will be quite interesting to engage indigenous people movements and the degrowth narrative. And particularly, just as an example, as Gabriela mentioned, here in Chile, we're currently discussing, or not really discussing, because the indigenous community that lives in the Atacama Desert, where the lithium is being mined, it's not so big. It's just around 200,000 people, but they are called the Atacameños. So, and they are currently seeing how the environment where they have lived for centuries, it's being slowly destroyed, because the salt lake where the lithium is being extracted, it's called the Atacama Salt Lake. So what I have been in my work, in my job, I talk to them frequently, and their position is, with this discourse of climate change and ecological transition, basically these firms are destroying the place that gives the name to this whole place. So I think that's an image to reflect if we should be developing this traditional transition idea of just trusting in the technology without the proper discussion of how to politicize technology. And therefore, I will strongly propose that we should think degrowth also as a political movement, and we have the chance to do it here in Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pedro, for these, and Gabriela, for these interesting and really illustrative conversations. Hopefully, we will have a bit of time to address a few questions about some of the topics that you both have touched upon. And I would like to pass the word now to our fourth speaker. This is Elizabeth Gervais. She's an economist, feminist, and peace activist. She currently holds a master's degree in economics and finance for development from the University of Bradford in the United Kingdom, and works as a research assistant at the Peace Research Institute at the University of Khartoum in Sudan, although she is from South Sudan. Elizabeth, I will not take more time from you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you guys can hear me well. It's a pleasure being among the speakers today and also being able to share my humble views about degrowth and climate change. I am going to make this fairly short overview about 4 questions, 4 or maybe 4 points. So the first one is going to be about the concept of degrowth itself. Then the second one is how can degrowth work in favor of reversing climate change in Africa? And the third one is what are the possible implications of degrowth in Africa? And finally, what is the way forward and some policies to share? So starting right away, degrowth, I mean, most my colleagues here covered most of the topics, most of this topic, but I'm just going to briefly highlight without being repetitive. I think it is very important for us to understand the dynamics behind degrowth beyond just a denomination, to be able to critically also see its correlation with climate change and development in continents like Africa. So the economics establishment is thoroughly supported by regulators and institutions that strongly favor markets, private enterprises, property rights, and economic growth. Sustainability, however, requires less or perhaps negative growth in developed countries, which is clearly not the case when it comes to developing countries. Now, since 1970s, the global economic consumption has by far exceeded the global capacity of regenerating natural resources and or absorbing emissions. The sources of this is the Global Footprint Network. You can check that afterwards. And also many studies show that carbon dioxide emissions increase in the early stages of economic growth, then it starts declining when they reach the verge point. And that makes the compatibility of economic growth remaining within a certain biophysical limits questionable. Consequently, integrating environmental and ecological aspects within the macroeconomics theories remain the biggest challenge for scientists and also economists to mitigate climate change. With all these views, an interest for investigating zero growth economies and the structural drivers and operatives has emerged. As an economist, I think today most of our focus is on decoupling economic activities and energy use as a way of reversing climate change. However, we should rather ask ourselves, will decoupling economic activities really reverse climate change in Africa? I believe the equation is not economic activities versus climate change. It is rather Grossism versus climate change. Why am I saying that? Because Grossism includes capitalism, includes productivism, with its diverse systems and names, extractivism and consumerism, and many other socioeconomic activities that have direct negative linkages to climate change. So it is not possible to have a sound conversation about carbon emissions and climate change without addressing the social and economic consequences of Grossism. Degrowth is a very recent model that aims to defamiliarize the familiar concepts and methods of economic growth and provides a wide critical space for us to reimagine and rethink what is happening today and what can be achieved in the future with reference to what happened in the past in this regard. To many people, degrowth is the notion of achieving prosperity without growth. However, the degrowth framework confronts traditional ideas of relentless growth, consumerism, and capitalism, but not, for instance, people not know that it actually promotes the idea of green economy. Now, degrowth is defined as an equitable downscaling of production and consumption that increases human well-being and enhances ecological conditions. But can it really be an equitable model for African economies to adopt? Now, going to the second point I'm going to speak about, which is degrowth and climate change, to help answer this last question. According to the latest emergency events database report, and from readings and following the news, we all see that 70% of major global droughts and floods occurred in Africa, particularly this year. Countries like my country, South Sudan, like Sudan, Kenya, Somalia, Malawi, Angola, Chad, and Ethiopia were particularly hit harder, and more than 16 million people were significantly affected. These incidents of extreme droughts and floods have had serious macroeconomic impacts on the macroeconomic of these countries, which is very much reflected in their annual GDPs. And scientists speculate that these trends of increasing global temperatures in Africa are likely to continue as a demonstration of the level and depth of the impact of climate change in Africa. Climate change poses a significant challenge to Africa because Africa's economies depends on a climate-sensitive natural resource base, such as rain-fed and subsistence agriculture. Africa's heavy dependence on natural resources exposes it to the risk of reduction in agriculture production and sanitation use, for example, and increases its risk of conflict over water, grazing resources, insect-borne diseases. Finally, Africa must play a more prominent role in the global governance of climate change issues. Africa's voice in the international climate change negotiations have been very, very limited. And the continent is literally struggling to influence global policies to tackle its particular issues that can actually come up with solutions that suits it. For instance, in the annual conference of parties, COP, organized by the United Nations Framework Convention, influencing policies favoring the continent, the implications of degrowth were not clearly addressed. Environmental assessment of economic growth in the northern part of the global region. It is, sorry, my laptop is acting up. All right, now, talking about what can actually be done in terms of policies and recommendations so that we can move forward. For Africa, Africa is by far the most affected continent by climate change. However, it is known to be the smaller contributor to the man-made climate change effects. However, these influences and representation in the international climate change negotiations are quite limited. There is a huge gap of social and economic injustice that need to be addressed and filled. The global north has the potential and ability to continue growing at a slower rate while decarbonizing and without necessarily ignoring the humanitarian crisis and consequences of degrowth on developing economies, such as African economies. That being said, the global north should immediately adopt degrowth and also allow the global south to equally thrive. Maintaining sustainable economic growth is more than a goal itself. But I think the sustainability of economic growth in Africa is a precondition to ending poverty. Imagine me going out in a village somewhere that is totally flooded, telling people about climate change and not cutting trees to get wood for fire, that there is a climate change disaster happening, and they are actually lacking security, food, shelter, and the basics needs in life. So maintaining sustainable economic growth in Africa has a lot to do with leadership, sound leadership in Africa. I think that African governments are not doing enough to address the issue and to tackle the issue, and also to include everyone on the continent. Policymakers and leaders must come together to increase their visibility in the international forum. Also, develop strategies that can guarantee Africa a suitable and fair deal that allows economies to thrive without upsetting nature. There are many other means to approach climate change in Africa, such as adopting wind turbines. We supply about 5% of global electricity, and it's increasing, and it's also less expensive than coal-generated electricity. Furthermore, there are other means like reducing food waste, managing food waste, recycling, investing in solar farms and solar systems. And all these can generate high capacity of megawatts, and they're also achievable on a cheaper costs. Finally, my recommendations is, number one, mitigation is a major alternative for Africa, which can include reduction of emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, REDD, and promoting green energy. Local governments should tap in to assist with the reclamation of degraded lands, reforestation, and also play an effective role in providing adaptation, mitigation, and income generation for the poor. Because forest restoration is such a potent solution, commitment and funding need to be a global priority for that. Africa needs initiatives that respect land right and tenure, especially those of indigenous people, making restoration a collaborative process that can ensure it is done in a fairly process and without eliminating the rights of the indigenous people. Secondly, I think expanding green growth in Africa, the continent needs to prioritize investment on research and development of improved agroeconomic practices, agriculture enterprises, and better water and soil conservation techniques. So much needs to be done in Africa. We know we're so much behind, but they have the potential. Africa has the potential. They just lack the good management and the sound leadership to put these policies into implementation. African governments should also invest more in irrigation facilities, physical infrastructures such as good roads to help delivering services to people who are yearly and annually being affected by climate change disasters. Making restoration a collaborative process can ensure it is done with and for local communities. That will also help in integrating the communities in Africa. Since African communities or African nations are divided based on tribes and communities, it's really difficult to unite the people. Finally, improving climate change resiliency by designing social safety nets and greater empowerment of the poor. African governments need to devise ways through which the most vulnerable members of society can also be protected in a better way from climate change disasters. And that way, they can be enabled to take advantage of the increasing demand of agriculture and participate in growing their economies without harming climate change. Economic barriers including lack of access and funds for girls, for example, going to schools. I think promoting girls' education is a long-term investment in balancing the ecological system. They are more likely to grow up aware and well-informed about sexual reproductive health, and that helps them to get or to have children by option, not by choice. Because This issue of population is now increasingly becoming a problem in Africa. It also gives the society a version of women who prioritize the advantages of having greenhouses rather than using firewood, coal, waste management, etc. I think I'm going to stop here without repeating myself and repeating what my colleagues said, and so that we can also have questions from the audiences. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Very, very important, of course, the view from Africa, not only because it's the continent that we need to make more room for, as Ricardo was saying before, but also because it's the fastest growing continent today, both economically and in population. So of course, yeah. So I'm not going to take. Yes, I'm not muted. Suddenly thought I was muted. I'm not going to take any more time for myself, and I'm going to jump directly to the questions. We have a lot of questions, so I'm not going to be able to ask them all. The first one, and I'm also going to ask you guys, please, to keep the answers as concise as possible. The first question is for Ricardo directly. You just, you mentioned in your presentation that 7 tons per person would be a sustainable carbon budget. The person asking is Tanguy Tomes. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. Could you possibly direct this person to a source for that number? He or she is interested in exploring how these would be calculated per person and per year. I think, Dizan, that we can open all the speakers.
Great.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, now I'm unmuted. Yeah, so I would recommend to check out the research conducted at the University of Leeds. The project is called Good Life Within Planetary Boundaries. And they conducted very interesting research looking at different ways of splitting up the available carbon budget, not just that, but also, let's say, global biocapacity, looking at what some sustainable levels would be. Of course, those scientific exercises, they should always be illuminated by ethical considerations, because there are different ways in which we can understand how to share the remaining budgets in terms of, shall we give every person on Earth the same levels of consumption, or shall we take into consideration historical data? So the fact that so many countries in the global North have hoarded a higher share of ecological space than countries in the global South. Therefore, the development is already, so to speak, under their belt, and therefore now they could actually use less to maintain their human development, let's say, at the current level, their social well-being at the current levels. So there is, of course, as always in this kind of considerations, not just one answer that science can provide us, but rather we should always look at the science and then gauge it from the perspective of ethics and global negotiations on how we come around to share the remaining budgets.
Thank you, Ricardo. I have very quickly searched for the source that Ricardo mentioned, and hopefully will be shared in the chat very quickly. Ricardo, if that is not exactly what you were talking about, please let us know, and we'll try to find again. Okay, the next question, there's 3 questions from the same person, David Jeffrey. I'm going to ask one of the 3, so I hope I'm going to get the most interesting one. And then after that, if we have time, I'll come to the other 2. Okay, so I think this question is a very good one for Pedro, but also probably for Elizabeth. Although David Jeffrey, who's the person asking, is asking any or all of the topics. So how do we unite people on all or most shades of the political spectrum? David suspects that most of us here would describe ourselves as towards the left wing on this spectrum. So how do we go beyond traditional thinking on politics or democracy to break this division? Pedro, I will give it first to you, and then because you talked specifically about this, and then if somebody else wants to answer, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. It's a really difficult question, but well, obviously I have to be honest. I'm a left-wing person. I actually am a member of a party here in Chile. But already like said that, I think we have to give that idea of political spectrum the amount of importance that has today. Like we have been experiencing over the last couple of decades, and not just in Europe, but in the world as a whole. I think that barrier that used to be so strong during the 20th century between left wing and right wing is definitely becoming thinner. And this is not just the typical discourse that maybe the elites are saying, but I think it has some evidence. Like first, all the populist governments and from right wing or traditionally left wing parties or initiatives that are getting to government or the power positions, that shows definitely. I think it's part of the decreasing legitimacy of the current economical system, obviously, but also on subjective processes that people experience. So, like, for instance, here in Chile, yesterday or 2 days ago, 80% of the population voted in favor of a new constitution. That's not left-wing people. And we don't have a strong left and right divide as we used to have. So I will, obviously we have to pose that question, but I think that question has much more to do to how do we convince the political elites and the government and the political parties instead of focusing on the people, which I would say now that some people, that's why I said like these 3 principles. Some people here in Chile, for instance, it's the experience that I know, obviously I'm more familiar with, but I would say that some people will be quite mobilized by the material being discourse or the social justice one. Another one will be also mobilized by the science-based idea. Because in a more educated population, as we are having here in Chile and also in Latin America, I think people tend to understand and provide this science-based evidence, science-based policy, more power than it used to be. So maybe those are a couple of ideas that I will propose, but obviously it's a quite difficult topic.
Achu, want to take the floor? Can we unmute Elizabeth, please?
I think it's a very simple question, but it's also very complicated because it depends on one's perspective. And I'm going to be speaking from an African woman perspective, a woman who lived in Africa, but also lived in the West, explored Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. I think education and exposure gave me a better understanding about global issues. And when I say global issues, I mean all issues, religion, social issues, and political issues. So I always carry in my heart the idea of not being radical, even in my radical ideas, not to be too radical. And I think it's okay to understand that people are different. We don't have to all agree on one aspect or one issue. It's just that we have to accept that we don't agree, but still work together to achieve what we want to achieve.
Thank you very much, Achu. I'm going to ask one more question, at least one more question. If we have time, 2 more. This one comes from, let me open it real quick. This one comes from YouTube. It's a question from a person called Camilo Junes Guzman. And he asks, he says that he's new to the topic. So how would you deal with the banking system in process of degrowth? So businesses or even cooperatives need to turn a profit to pay a loan in aggregated terms. Then growth must happen. Shifting towards growth to, he proposed maybe the idea is to shift growth to non-energy or material intensive sectors. Who would like to take this question? I think this is great for you, Achu, as well, but not for you. Okay, Gabriela, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, she can answer. She can answer first.
All right, we can do both. Yeah.
Okay, good. Thanks for that question. Am I going first? Sorry, didn't mean to
Yes,
interrupt.
Sandra. Yes.
Okay, thanks. Yes,
No.
that's a very, very good question, and it's a critical thing because once you have convinced someone that degrowth is necessary, it's like, okay, how do we get to the nitty-gritty of not just the political project, but what is going to be the instrument? Like, how are we going to use money? Is the money that we have now in our current globalized financial system the money that can help us to degrow? And the answer, as he is hinting, is no. Our current monetary system is designed for growth. It demands you to grow through the way money is created, through loans, and through this idea that you need to be constantly expanding to exist. It's like grow or die, right? This is the narrative and the imposition. Even if you want to have something like a social enterprise or work as a cooperative, it's extremely hard to exit this logic that is inscribed on our money. So this is actually one of the main challenges. And I think in the degrowth movement, this is like an open conversation. We have talked a lot about how we could redesign money for degrowth and how, for instance, we could have a money that rather than grow through time can be designed to lose its value through time in a way that emulates ecological cycles, for instance. And I think there is a lot we can learn from current efforts of community currencies and alternative currencies that show us a different way of circulating value that is more localized and it's more democratic rather than we have now, that it actually makes most of us dependent on what a few central banks and big banks are deciding to do with the money. So yes, this is it's still an open question. We don't know the answer. And that's like where a lot of power can be taken and put into the service for degrowth.
Achu, want to add anything else? Can we unmute Elizabeth, please?
Yes, like I said before, degrowth is designed, the framework of degrowth is very recent. It's something new even for us. For me, when I was doing my master's degree 2 years ago, I didn't even come across that. So people are still getting to understand how degrowth must work or should work in different economic dynamics. Because economics is also very complicated. Banking system is not less than that. And like my colleague said, it's designed and builds and evolves around more money and more growth. If there is no money, then there is no growth. So the whole idea is about relentless, how to confront traditional ideas of relentless growth and also capitalism. And I think if we think deeper and maybe come up with new strategies that can incorporate ecological and environmental approaches, to incorporate them with the macroeconomics approaches that we use in our countries or in our financial systems, I think this might lessen or help us approach what you just asked for and how to deal with money in this regard.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. We have more questions, but unfortunately it's a bit too late. We asked our speakers to reserve 1 hour for us, and they unfortunately have to have another compromises and commitments after this. So I'm sorry if you couldn't get to your question. Hopefully next time. We organize this sort of webinars every month at the end of each month. So follow our social networks to keep in touch. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you very much, Ricardo, Gabriela, Pedro, and Elizabeth, for taking the time and for sharing your expertise. I think this was a very, very good time and a great opportunity to learn from this. I had a lot of questions of my own that I couldn't ask, but I think I'll probably write something about it in the next couple of days and post it in Climate Tracker. So thank you very much, everybody, and hope to see you again in future webinars. Bye-bye. Have a very good afternoon, morning, or evening, whatever you're in the world. Bye-bye.
Bye.